arrived at part 5 of Laura Hillenbrand's Unbroken. From here on out in the book is pretty much uncharted waters by the movie. They kind of stop the movie once Louis gets home and just have a short afterward, but there's a whole section of the book left, so we're going to hear about what happens to Louis after the war. If you remember in the last chapter, Louis just got home. He's reunited with his family. It's a really exciting moment. And so chapter 34, which is on page 341, jumps back once he's back in the U.S., and this is called The Shimmering Girl. On an October afternoon, Louis stepped out of an army car and stood on the lawn at 2028 Gramercy Avenue, looking at his parents' house for the first time in more than 3 years. This little home, he said, was worth all of it. As his parents and siblings filed into the house, Louis paused, overcome by a strange uneasiness. He had to push himself to walk up the steps. The house was done up top to bottom for his homecoming. The surface of the dining room table was a traffic jam of heaping dishes. 3 years' worth of Christmas and birthday presents sat ready for opening. There was a cake with "Welcome Home, Louis" inscribed in the icing. In the garage sat Louis's beige Plymouth convertible, just as he had left it. The family ringed around Louis, babbling, eager to look at him and touch him. Anthony and Louise smiled, but there was a cast to their eyes, a tension that had never been there before. What Louis didn't see was the rash on his mother's hands. As soon as Louise had learned that her son was coming home, the rash had vanished. Remember, she always shows her stress by getting that terrible rash on her hands. Nothing, not even a scar, remained. She would never tell Louis about it. After dessert, the family sat and talked. They spoke easily, as they always had. No one asked about prison camp. Louis volunteered a little about it, and to everyone's relief, it seemed to carry little emotion for him. It seemed that he was going to be just fine. And you can see up here, here's Louis sitting with all of his family. It says left to right, you've got Sylvia and Anthony, so that's Louis's dad and sister. Then you've got Louis, his mom Louise, and there's Pete, his brother, in Virginia. Sylvia had a surprise for Louis. Lynn Moody, the woman who had transcribed Louis's broadcast, had arranged for a recording of it to be sent to the Zamparinis. The family treasured the record, which had given them proof that he was alive. Knowing nothing of the circumstances in which the broadcast had been made, Sylvia was eager to share it with Louis. As he sat nearby, relaxed and cheerful, she dropped the record on the turntable. The broadcast began to play. Louis was suddenly screaming. Sylvia turned and found him shaking violently, shouting, take it off! I can't stand it!" As Sylvia jumped up, Louis swore at the voice, yelling something about propaganda prisoners. Sylvia snatched up the record, and Louis yelled at her to break it. She smashed it and threw it away. Louis fell silent, shivering. His family stared at him in horror. Louis walked upstairs and lay down on his old bed. When he finally drifted off, the bird followed him into his dreams. So Louis is back and he's safe, and his family thinks, hey, he's going to be okay. But as readers, we know the terrible thing that Louis has gone through, and he hasn't shared that with anyone. He hasn't told anyone about it. So Louis suffered a lot of trauma. He's got some PTSD, and so we're going to see in this next section Louis trying to adapt back to normal life, but also really needing to work through the terror he's just survived. The same man was on many other minds that fall. On ships docked at Yokohama, in tents in Manila, and in stateside hospitals, former POWs were telling their stories. Investigators, gathering affidavits on war criminals, sat by as men told of abuses and atrocities, terrible things, that pushed the bounds of believability. As the stories were corroborated, so they were checked against each other, again and again, it became clear that these events had been commonplace in camps throughout Japan's empire. Right? So no one really knew what was going on in these camps, but as the prisoners head home and start to tell stories, people start to realize how bad it really was. In interview after interview, former POWs mentioned the same name, Mutsuhiro Watanabe, which is the bird. When Wade wrote that name in his statement, his interviewer exclaimed, "Not the same Watanabe. We've got enough to hang him 6 times already." "Sit back and take it easy," Wade replied. "There's lots more to come." On September 11th, General MacArthur, now the supreme commander of Allied powers in occupied Japan, ordered the arrest of 40 war crime suspects. While thousands of men would be sought later, this preliminary list was composed of those accused of the worst crimes, including list topper Hideki Tojo, mastermind of Pearl Harbor, and the man on whose orders POWs had been enslaved and starved, and Matsuhiro Homa, who was responsible for the Bataan Death March. On the list with them was Matsuhiro Watanabe. So remember, the bird escaped right at the end of the war, but he's ordered to be arrested for committing war crimes. The bird had left Nuetsu in a panic and without a plan. According to Watanabe family accounts, he fled to the village of Kusakabe, where his mother and other relatives were living. About a week and a half after Mitsuhiro's arrival, his aunt found him out drinking and told him that she'd just heard a radio broadcast naming him as a war crime suspect. Mitsuhiro decided to make a run for it. He apparently told his mother that he was leaving to visit a friend's tomb, then took his little sister aside and told her that he had to escape, but asked her not to tell his mother. As Mitsuhiro was preparing to go, his little sister gave him a deck of playing cards to be used for fortune-telling. Wearing his uniform with the insignia torn off, Mitsuhiro packed a trunk with food and clothing and lugged it to a car. He drove to the rail station and walked onto the first train he saw without checking its destination. He hoped it would take him to some place distant and obscure, unknown. But the train reached its terminus, or its end, only 2 towns down the line at the metropolis, the big city of Kofu. He got off, wandered the station, then lay down and slept. In the morning, he meandered around Kofu. Somewhere in the city, he passed a radio and heard his name listed among those wanted for war crimes. To learn that he was being sought was no surprise, but he was shocked to hear his name listed alongside that of Tojo. If his case was considered comparable to that of Tojo, he thought, arrest would mean execution. So he's recognizing that if they think his crimes are as serious as Tojo, who's really high up in the Japanese military and government, then he knows if he gets arrested, he'll be killed. At all costs, he vowed, he wouldn't let himself fall into the hands of the Americans. He resolved to disappear forever. As Mitsuhiro fled, the hunt for him began. Though they were now operating under the orders of their former enemies, the Japanese police worked swiftly and energetically to round up war crime suspects. The Watanabe case was no exception. After finding nothing at Mitsuhiro's last known address, police appeared at his mother's door in Kusakabe. Shizuka Watanabe told them that her son had been there but had left. They had missed him by 3 days. Shizuka suggested he might seek refuge with his sister, Michiko, who lived in Tokyo. She'd soon be visiting Michiko, she said, and if she found Mitsuhiro there, she'd urge him to turn himself in. The police seized on the lead. Shizuka gave them an address for Michiko, and they converged on it. So they followed and met up at that place. Not only was there no Michiko there was no house. Every home in the neighborhood had burned long ago in the firebombing. Shizuka was now the focus of suspicion. On her regular visits to Tokyo, she always stayed with Michiko, and given that she was scheduled to do so that very week, she surely knew that her daughter's home had burned down. Shizuka's misdirection of the detectives may have been an honest mistake. Michiko had moved to a home down the same road, so the only change in the address was the door number. But the police began to suspect that she knew where her son was. On September 24th, the police arrested her. If she knew anything, she let nothing slip. She was released. The police were a long way from giving up. 2 detectives began tailing Shizuka and often came into her home to question her. Her monetary transactions were tracked, so they tracked how she spent her money, and her landlord was regularly questioned. Mitsuhiro's other relatives were investigated, questioned, and sometimes searched. Police intercepted all of the family's incoming and outgoing mail. They even had a stranger deliver a fake letter, apparently making it appear to be from Mitsuhiro, in hopes of getting the family to betray his whereabouts. Widening the hunt, the police investigated Mitsuhiro's former army roommates. The home of his Amori commander was searched and put under surveillance. Mitsuhiro's photograph was distributed throughout police ranks in the Tokyo metropolitan area and 4 prefectures. Every police station in Nagano Prefecture, where a Watanabe family mine was located, conducted special searches. Detectives went through Mitsuhiro's academic records and searched for his teachers and classmates going back to his childhood. They even got a hold of a love letter from a girl who asked Mitsuhiro if he'd marry her. They found only 2 leads. A former soldier told them that Matsuhiro had spoken of his intention to flee to Fukuoka Prefecture to be a farmer. The soldier thought that Matsuhiro would hide with a friend named Yo. Police found Yo, questioned and investigated him, and questioned people in his neighborhood. It was a dead lead. Meanwhile, a detective at Mutsuhima found a man who'd seen Matsuhiro in August. The man said that Matsuhiro had left, claiming to be headed for Tokyo at the war's end. But Matsuhiro had gone to Kusakabe. There was no evidence he'd gone to Tokyo. He may have seeded his acquaintances with false information to misdirect his pursuers. So basically, he's doing a really good job of hiding, and they're getting nowhere, even tailing his family, going through their mail. They can't find him. There was the one other possible clue. The man at Mutsuhima mentioned something he had overheard Matsuhiro saying. He would rather kill himself than be captured. It seemed no idle threat. That fall, during a roundup of suspected war criminals, there was a wave of suicides among those sought. Perhaps the bird was already dead. While investigators combed Japan for Matsuhiro, prosecutors were inundated with some 250 POW affidavits concerning his actions in camps. These would be distilled into an 84-count indictment. Even with each count stated with maximum brevity in single spacing, the indictment stretched over 8 feet of paper. So even when they don't say very much, it's single-spaced, this still takes up tons and tons of paper space because there's so many people who they're trying to track down. It would reflect only a tiny fraction of the crimes that POWs said Watanabe had committed. Louis' accusations of myriad attacks would make up only one count. So, when I talk about the indictment, this is talking about all of the different things that the bird did. And so the list goes on and on and on because it's crimes committed against so many people. Investigators believe they had far more evidence than they needed to have Watanabe convicted and put to death. But nothing could go forward. The bird was still at large. At large means he's still missing. As his tormentor disappeared into darkness, Louis was pulled into blinding light. With his Odyssean saga featured in newspapers, magazines, and radio shows. And this means it's like the Odyssey. The story where, they go and there's the sirens and they're on the boat and eventually Odysseus has to make it back home. So that's Louis' story. Anyway, so he's becoming famous. He was a national sensation. 2,000 people wrote him letters. Press photographers tailed him. His attempts to sleep were invariably interrupted by a ringing phone. Strangers teamed around him, pushing for news on what he'd do next. Everyone wanted him to tell his story. The War Department booked him on a speaking tour, and he was inundated with speaking invitations that usually came with an award, making them impossible to decline. In his first weeks home, staying with his parents, he gave 95 speeches and made countless radio appearances. When he went to dinner clubs, the managers begged him to regale the guests. For Louis, all the attention was drenching, a great noise, overpowering. When Peyton Jordan first saw Louis again, he was reassured by his old friend's familiar impish grin, that's like kind of mischievous grin, and the springy cadence of his speech. But when Louis spoke of the war, Jordan sensed something rustling just behind his eyes, a clamoring emotion pent up in a small space. He spoke not with anger or anguish or like being upset, great emotion, but with bewilderment, like he's almost confused. Sometimes he'd pause and drift off, a troubled expression on his face. It was like he got hit real hard, Jordan recalled, and he was trying to shake it off. Louis was struggling more than Jordan or anyone else knew. He was beginning to suffer bouts of suffocating anxiety. Each time he was asked to stand before a crowd and shape words around his private horror, his gut would ring. Every night in his dreams, an apparition or a ghost would form in his head and burn there. It was the face of the bird, screaming, "Next! Next! Next!" Which, remember, is what he screamed when Louis was getting punched all those times. So Louis going through, he's reliving these terrible events, but he's not talking to anyone about it. So here his friend Peyton Jordan can tell something's wrong, but no one really knows how bad it is. Very early one morning, Louis tiptoed from his room without telling anyone where he was going, slid into his Plymouth, put his foot on the gas, and didn't stop until he was high in the mountains. He spent the day walking among the trees, thinking of his dead friends and his own survival. drawing from the wilderness the peace that it had given him since his boyhood summer in the Coahuila Reservation. The moment he nosed the car back in the driveway, the whirling began again. Shortly after returning home, Louis found himself sitting in the audience at a gala held by the Los Angeles Times, which was giving him an award. Louis forked through his dinner, waiting for his name to be announced, apprehensive over having to relive his ordeal before all these people. Drinks were set before him, and he sipped them and felt his nerves unwinding. By the time he rose to speak, he was in a haze, and he rambled on for much too long. When he got back to his seat, he felt relieved. The alcohol had brought him a pleasant numbness. One day, not long after, as he sat at breakfast and fretted over the prospect of another speech, he broke out a bottle of Canadian Club whiskey and poured a shot into his coffee. That gave him a warm feeling, so he had another shot. It couldn't hurt to have a third. The whiskey floated him through that speech too, and so began a routine. A flask became his constant companion, making furtive or sneaky appearances in parking lots and corridors outside speaking halls. When the harsh push of memory ran through Louis, reaching for his flask became as easy as slapping a swatter on a fly. So this is where we see a shift, right? Louis has these terrible memories. He's not sure what to do with them. They're haunting him. And so he starts to drink because it kind of numbs the experience and he doesn't have to think about it. But he's thinking about these terrible things so frequently that means he has to drink frequently. One afternoon in the middle of March 1946, Louis was at a bar in the Deauville Club in Miami Beach, chatting up a stewardess. He had just completed the latest of many surreal liberation experiences, traveling to New York to fire the starting gun for Madison Square Garden's Zamperini Invitational Mile, the race conceived to honor him when almost everyone thought he was dead. After the race, he'd come to Miami Beach for the 2 weeks of R&R awarded to returning servicemen, meaning rest and relaxation. A USC classmate, Harry Reid, had accompanied him. Across the room, a door opened up. Louis glanced up. Flitting into the club was an arrestingly beautiful young woman, her hair a tumble of blondness, her body as quick and graceful as a deer's. Those who knew her spoke of a shimmer about her, an incandescence, or like a glow. Louis drank in one long look, and he later told Sylvia, had the astounding thought that he had to marry this girl. The next day, Louis and Harry returned to the club, vaulted the fence surrounding its private beach, and spread their towels near a pair of sunbathing women. When one of the women turned, Louis saw that it was the beauty from the bar. He was hesitant to speak to her, afraid that he'd come off as a wolf, but Harry charged right in, regaling the women with Louis's history. When Harry mentioned the 1938 NCAA championships, when rival runners had spiked Louis's legs, the pretty woman stopped him. There we go. She said that when she was 12, her mother had taken her to the theater to see Errol Flynn in Robin Hood, and there she'd watched a newsreel showing the NCAA mile winner and his bandaged legs. The sight had stuck in her mind. Her name was Cynthia Applewhite, and she was a few weeks past her 20th birthday. Louis spoke with her for a while, and the two discovered that they had geography in common. As a child, she had lived near Torrance. She seemed to like him, and he thought her bright and lively and so beautiful. When they parted, Louis grumbled something about how she probably wouldn't want to see him again. Maybe, she said playfully, I want to see you again. Louis wasn't the first guy to be felled by Cynthia. Dense forests of men had gone down at the sight of her. She was dating 2 guys at once, both named Mac, and each Mac was trying to outlast the other. Since the Macs had Cynthia booked for every evening, Louis asked her for a daytime date to go fishing. Showing up in blue jeans rolled up to the knee, she took up a fishing pole, smiled gaily for photographs, and braved seasickness with cheer. When Louis asked if he could take her out again, she said yes. They seemed an unlikely pair. Cynthia was wealthy and pedigreed. She'd been educated in private schools, then in an elite finishing academy. But for all the polishing, she was not a buttoned-up girl. A friend would remember her as different, passionate, and impulsive. At 13, when her family lived in New York State, she developed such a fever for Laurence Olivier, it's a movie star, that unbeknownst to her parents, she hopped a train to Manhattan to see him in Wuthering Heights. At 16, she was drinking gin. She dressed in bohemian clothes, penned novels, painted, and yearned to roam forgotten corners of the world. She was habitually defiant and fearless, so she pushes back against authority. She's not scared of things. And when she felt controlled, as she often did, she could be irresistibly willful. Now, we know this is a quality that Louis definitely has, right? Anytime someone tries to control him, he gets angry and pushes back. Mostly, she was bored silly by the vanilla sort of boys who trailed her around and by the stodgy set in Miami Beach. Along came Louis. Here was someone exotic, someone who answered her yearning for adventure, understood her fiercely independent personality, and was from nowhere near Miami Beach. She was impressed with this older man, introducing him with his full name as if he were a dignitary. On one of their first dates, he raced her through his hotel, snatching up toilet paper rolls and streaming them down the side of the building, earning the hotel manager's wrath and Cynthia's exhilaration. So Louis getting into trouble, but Cynthia loves it, right? She thinks this is a lot of fun. She gave up the max, and she and Louis swept around Miami. And here's a picture of Cynthia the day after Louis met her when she is the sunbathing beauty. At the end of March, just before he was to leave for a speaking tour, Louis led Cynthia onto a beach and confessed he was in love with her. Cynthia replied that she thought she loved him but wasn't sure. Louis was undiscouraged. Before their walk was done, he had talked her into marrying him. They'd known each other for less than 2 weeks. After Louis left, Cynthia broke the news to her parents. The Applewhites were alarmed that their daughter was flinging herself into marriage with a 29-year-old soldier whom she'd known for just days. Cynthia couldn't be swayed, so Mrs. Applewhite refused to give her money to fly to California to get married. Cynthia vowed to get the money somehow, either by borrowing it or, in defiance of her mother, getting a job. Louis wrote to Cynthia almost every day, and every morning at 10:30, he sat, waiting for the mailman to bring him a pink envelope from Cynthia. Though the letters were adoring on both sides, they reveal how little the two knew about each other. Cynthia had no idea that Louis was losing his emotional equilibrium, meaning that Louis is losing his balance. There's nothing keeping him steady because he's facing all this trauma. From Harry, she knew a little about his time as a POW, but Louis had said almost nothing. In his letters, the closest he came to addressing it was to joke that he hoped she'd go easy on rice and barley in her cooking. On one of their dates, Louis had gotten very drunk, but he had apologized and curbed himself from then on. Louis' drinking may have struck Cynthia as harmless, but it was in fact a growing problem. In critical ways, she was engaged to a stranger, right? They really don't know each other. She has no idea what sorts of really big problems Louis is just starting to face. Louis seemed to be aware that in marrying her, he was asking more of her than she knew, and he frequently warned her of how much she was taking on. Still, he wanted a wedding as soon as possible. "We've got to set a date early in June," he wrote in mid-April, "or I'll just go plain crazy." Soon after, he wrote they had to marry in May. She told him that she'd help him forget his past, and he grasped her promise as a lifeline. "If you love me enough," he wrote back, "I'll have to forget it. How much can you love?" Which we can look in and say, Louis is clinging to Cynthia to try and make his problems, his terrible memories, the trauma go away. But we can also predict that as he's drinking more, he's not finding any healthy outlet for this pain that he's going through. This marriage is going to be in trouble. As Cynthia worked on her parents, Louis went into wedding overdrive. He tracked down reception sites, invitations, a caterer, and a jeweler. He found the Church of Our Savior, which Cynthia had attended as a child. He bought a used Chevy convertible and overhauled it to impress Cynthia. Trying to make a new man of himself, he quit drinking and smoking. He took terminal leave from the Air Force, meaning that he formally ended active duty, but would still wear his uniform and draw pay until his accumulated leave ran out in August, at which time he'd become a captain in the Air Force Reserve. He began a low-paying job at the Warner Brothers Studios, teaching actors how to ride horses. What he didn't have was a proper place to live. Because Los Angeles was teeming with repatriated soldiers, the soldiers who had just gotten back, inexpensive housing was all but impossible to find, so Louis was still living with his parents. Cynthia wrote of how badly she wanted a home of her own, but Louis, in some distress, he's like, we can't do anything about it, he wrote back to explain that he didn't have the money. The best he could do was move into the house that Harry Reid shared with his mother and promised Cynthia that he'd do whatever he could to earn enough money for a home. He bought an air mattress for Cynthia. He'd sleep on the floor. After POW camp, he said he didn't mind sleeping on floors. The Applewhites' opposition to the marriage, the pressure to make a good life for Cynthia, and his black memories left Louis taut with stress. He had little appetite. He was emerging from years in which the only constants were violence and loss, and his letters show how much he feared something terrible befalling Cynthia. He clung to the thought of her as if at any moment she might be torn from his hands. He was especially worried about her parents' views of him. He felt certain that they objected to him personally, finding his Italian ethnicity and middle-class origins repellent, so they don't like him because he's poor and Italian. He wrote earnest letters to her father, trying to win him over. When he kept seeing the same car parked by the Reeds' house, he became convinced it was a detective hired by Cynthia's father. According to Cynthia's brother Rick, his parents had no objection to Louis, only to a hasty marriage, like really quickly without thought. As for the spying, Rick said, such an act would be as unlike his easygoing father and would have made no sense, as Mr. Applewhite liked Louis. Right or wrong, Louis' suspicions illustrated how sensitive he was to the idea that he was unworthy of Cynthia. Perhaps it wasn't the Applewhites he was trying to convince, right? Laura Hillenbrand's kind of trying to clue us in here to say, Louis is really insecure, he's really unsettled right now, he's not emotionally stable, and he's trying to convince himself that he deserves to be with Cynthia, probably more than anyone else. 6 months after returning from Japan, Louis began to feel a familiar pull. It had just been announced that the Summer Olympic Games, which hadn't been held since 1936, were set to return. They'd be held in London in July 1948. Louis' bad leg felt passably sound. Remember, he had fallen and hurt his ankle. And he finally felt healthy. He began testing himself with long hikes, borrowing a dog for company. The leg felt sturdy, the body strong. July of 48 was more than 2 years away. Louis began training. In May, Cynthia and her parents made a deal. Cynthia could visit Louis on the condition that they would not marry until the fall in a ceremony at the Applewhite mansion. Cynthia threw her clothes into a suitcase and went to the airport. As she left, her brother Rick felt a pang of worry. He was afraid that his young sister, dashing off to be with a man she hardly knew, might be making an enormous mistake. At Burbank Airport on May 17th, a plane stopped on the tarmac. The stairway unfolded, and Louis bounded up the steps to embrace Cynthia, then squired her home to meet his family. The Zamparinis fell for her, just as Louis had. Driving away after the visit, Louis sensed that Cynthia was drawing backward. Maybe during their visit there had been a word or a look that hinted at all she didn't know. Or maybe impulsive decisions made in the fog of lovesickness were becoming real. Whatever it was, Louis thought he was losing her. He lost his temper and abruptly said that maybe they should call off the engagement. Cynthia panicked and they argued overwrought. When they calmed down, they made a decision. On Saturday, May 25th, the same day that the papers quoted Louis as saying he'd marry Cynthia at the summer's end, Louis and Cynthia drove to the Church of Our Savior, where the Zamparinis were waiting. He wore his dress uniform. She wore a simple off-white suit. One of Louis's college buddies walked Cynthia down the aisle, and Louis and Cynthia said their vows. There had been no time to bake a wedding cake, so Pete's birthday cake, made by Sylvia the day before, did double duty. Suspecting that Louis's friends would pull wedding night pranks, the newlyweds stole off to an obscure hotel, and Cynthia called home. Her announcement prompted an explosion. Cynthia hung on the phone all evening crying, while her mother, who'd gone to great effort to plan a fall wedding, bawled her out. Louis sat by listening as his bride was excoriated for marrying him, trying in vain to get her to hang up. Eventually, he picked up a bottle of champagne, popped it open, drank it dry, and went to sleep by himself. It's just such a terrible moment. You want to be so happy for Louis and for finding someone to be with, and it's a wedding, but you know that there's all of this underlying turmoil, and that things are really not off to a good start. But we're going to pause right there at the end of this chapter.